All right. Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all of us to the 2023 Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. My name is Claire Smith. I'm a teacher and administrator at Highville Charter in New Haven, Connecticut. And I'm here to speak tonight with Stephen Briseño about immigration themes in his book, The Notebook Keeper. And before we jump into that conversation, I just want to please direct everyone to our anti-harassment policy in the chat box. And please don't forget to subscribe to the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival's YouTube channel. And if you are a school, classroom, librarian, or educator joining us, our school visit fund is back. You can enter to win a free virtual visit from a Latinx author or illustrator for your classroom or library. You can find that link to the entry form in the chat as well. So again, thank you all for coming. So as I said, my name is Claire Smith. I work at Highville Charter School, which is a school in New Haven, Connecticut. I am an administrator, and I also teach African American and Latinx studies there. And I'm here for a conversation with Stephen Briseño, the author of The Notebook Keeper. So Stephen is an English language arts teacher living in San Antonio, Texas. And The Notebook Keeper is his first children's book and received a Pura Belpré honor. And a starred review book list called it a heartening story, emphasizing the real ways generous people step up in the crisis. So thank you and welcome, Stephen.
Thank you for having me. It's so awesome to be here.
All right. Yes. No, I'm so excited to talk to you about this. I have a lot of questions and just comments in general. So I'm excited to dive in. But first and foremost, for those who haven't read it, can you just tell us a little bit more about what The Notebook Keeper is about?
Yes, The Notebook Keeper is a mixture of fiction and nonfiction. The nonfiction part is that for several years at the San Ysidro border checkpoint, an unofficial system began where people seeking refuge in the United States had to put their names in what was called the Notebook, and it was this unofficial ledger that families had to, or individuals had to put their name in, and they would get a number, like getting a number at a deli counter, pretty much. And every morning, U.S. Customs officials would say, all right, we're going to see this amount of people. And the notebook keeper would call their names out. And I'd heard this story years ago, and it's one that rattled me. So I decided to write a story surrounding it of a girl. So the story is about Noemi, a girl from Mexico, whose father is gone, and her mom decides we must leave. That our only option is to leave. And so she encounters this system at the border and is so torn up by it, and because she sees so much unkindness around her, and she decides to do something about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. No, I really you could feel that, I think, in the story. And, I'm a secondary teacher. I teach high school. However, I felt that there were so many themes in this that really translate across grade levels. And this is such a great opener to a lot of different conversations about immigration, refugee status, and even just the concept of borders and like how we let some people in and how we don't let some people in.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I definitely, if you have not yet read it, I please encourage you to read it. I think it has a multitude of uses in across classroom spaces. And when we talk about books with like border crossing, we usually hear people refer to it as like an immigrant story. Do you feel that refugee story in this context would be a more appropriate term?
Yeah, most definitely, because the stories that when I was researching this, the overwhelming story was we're not just leaving just to leave. It was we are fleeing something. We are seeking refuge, and that would definitely be a more appropriate signifier for this story. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, what I was like kind of struck by this, like the idea too, as with borders being such a liminal space, and right, and like as people are getting their numbers and names put, or their names put into the notebook, and then getting assigned a number, it's almost an erasure of who they are, and they just become this monolith of just people rather than these individual stories. And I think what was really special about this book is that it really highlights the individual, like Nomi going through this process as a person and like seeing her thoughts, feelings as an individual through it.
Absolutely. Well, I live in Texas, born and raised here. I'm currently in San Antonio, and the border's always been a part of who we are as a state. And as the years, at least in my own lifetime, as the years have progressed, it's become so polarizing, and where we don't, it's just now like it's just called the border.
Hmm.
We completely ignore the people that are there, the people that live there, and the lifestyle. Like it's such a warm, welcoming place. My mom is from the border originally, and it's just we're so quick to, like you said, make it a monolith. Like we try to erase the faces as often as we can to help remove ourselves from the guilt of it and from the humanity of what's happening, and it just breaks my heart. So I really, as I was writing this, I wanted to not just tell a general story, like a nonfiction type informative. I wanted to put, even though she's fictional, I wanted to put a face and a name to this experience that people had gone through. So
No, 100%. And I think that, for younger readers as well, like just having these touch points and having such an easy access point to kind of talk about these broader discussions is going to be so helpful. And it's something that I know I haven't really seen so far in the literary landscape for children, right? Like having a moment to like really talk about an individual story and use that to talk about much deeper issues, and thematic points and things of that nature. So that was really exciting for me as well to kind of dig into. I know that you are also teaching. You're in middle school, correct?
yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So like, I mean, have you used this book in your own classroom? Like, how is this kind of translated into your own teaching?
Immensely. My wife is also an English teacher, and we both teach sixth grade English, and we have a daughter who's in fifth grade, and we're just a bunch of English teacher nerds. So picture books and books, as you can tell behind me, they're very much a part of my family and a part of our classrooms.
Mhm.
And we love them so much. We actually just had another book come out called Text Structures from Picture Books from Corwin Publishing.
Okay.
And it's just 50 lessons from 50 different picture books. And my wife was like, we have to include your book. So I've read it to my students. There's an event in my school tonight called Camp Reads More, and it's just this literacy event. And last year I was the author and got to read it to like 95% of the school. So it's become a huge part of my classroom. I have it up in my room, not only like the story itself, but the idea that I've always had this dream of being an author since I was a little kid, and I've just loved stories, and I never imagined that I'd be here at this point. So it's something that I always point to my students, like you can do this. If I can do it, you can do it. You have stories that are worth telling, and you need to tell them. And if someone like me, just a humble English teacher can do it, there's no reason for you not to as well. So it's just become a neat part of my classroom. When the Pura Belpré awards were happening, I was teaching like the announcements, and I knew that it was coming, and so I was teaching, and I had my computer open, like
Oh,
watching it. And then once it was finally my turn, I was like, guys, let's watch this, and I put it on the screen. They had no idea. And then when they see the book and my name, and they just started clapping and cheering,
oh,
it's just been a really, as a teacher,
right.
to share it with my students, it's just been surreal. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but it's just been
No, I
a
think that's
wonderful
so
part of
great.
my classroom. So
And I think that it makes it a much more, I think, meaningful process too, right? Like that it has these multitude of, not only like, yes, the social political aspect of it, but then the personal aspect too, like you as the author kind of going through this process and being able to celebrate with your students and then having them celebrate you and then also see you as like a tangible touch point of like, hey, this is possible. I have an idea, I have a story, and I want to be able to tell and share it with the world. And like, hey, I know that Mr. Briseño was able to do it, and so maybe so can
yeah,
I.
yeah, it's been wild. Just a
Yeah.
wonderful, humbling experience the last couple of years. So
Oh, awesome. No, that warms me to like hear that. That's amazing. One of the things too that really touched me was like the last lines of the book, actually, right? It said, for those who wait, and for those who still have a long way to walk.
mhm.
It kind of read like a dedication. Is that like what the meaning of that was, or?
In a weird way, yes, that is one of, throughout the editing. I think I wrote by the time the book was sold and going to be published, I think I'd written 15 or 16 drafts, and those 3 lines never changed. They have been the same since the very first draft, and it's just, I think about the people that are there, and I always wanted the story, kind of like, I don't know if you're familiar with the story Each Kindness by Jacqueline Woodson, another fantastic picture book,
Mhm.
but it does not end with like everything all neat and pretty in a bow. And I wanted this, that was always my goal, and it's just, it felt like the right thing to do. Almost, I would have phrased it just like that, like as a dedication, but I guess in my heart, in the back of my mind, it was. So, um, knowing that like those words haven't, been touched, um, I think, and then that it stood out to you is just a testament to hopefully what I was aiming to do. That like this is for those that, especially I've had students in the past, like that's their experience. Like this is
Right.
for you. Um, those that are still, they have a long way to walk, and yeah.
Well, and I think it definitely, like, it kind of, it just made me pause. I think upon ending the book and like finishing it, it really made me take a pause and to think about, this is very much still an ongoing process. And while, like, I think in the end cover flap, it says that the notebook keeper, it's not necessarily something that's happening anymore. But again, people are still in that liminal space, right? People are
Yeah.
still kind of going through and having to wait for someone to finally deem them, good to go, or no, you have to go back and try again. So I think it just adds to like a different sense of gravity to everything.
Thank you.
So I know I really appreciated that. I think kind of shifting a little bit back to the classroom space, how would you recommend other teachers could use this in their spaces and in their conversations with their
Yeah.
students?
So, it, it's crazy that you say that. So in my latest book for teachers, the lessons that I have specifically for this book is, we always start with a quick write, and we ask. I ask my students. I've done this with my students, where, tell me about a time where you were either kind to someone or someone was kind towards you. What was that story? And without fail, there's usually something that a student will remember, that like, I forgot that so and so did this for me. And we start with this really, and we all kind of share, those that are willing, and we start with this very like peaceful, grateful space of like, oh, like, yeah, we've all experienced kindness in some way or another. And then we'll read the story, and they'll point out like, oh, like this is where, Belinda the notebook keeper was kind, and this is where Noemi was kind, and how if that hadn't have happened, how much of a darker story it would be.
Mhm.
Like, if we didn't have kindness. Another quote that was, as I was writing it, that was rattling in the back of my mind, is the quote from Mr. Rogers, where like, when there's trouble, look for the helpers. And,
Mhm.
that was also like, again, in the back of my mind as I was writing the first drafts of this story. And students will often say that, um, if a person hadn't have been kind to them, they think of the trajectory of where their life would have gone. Whether it's something small, as like a kind word, especially teaching middle schoolers, that their identity is still forming, and
Mhm.
to a degree is so fragile, and more often than not, they're bombarded with unkindness, whether that's, their home life, like how, like their family income, socioeconomic status, their body image, whatever it may be. They're constantly bombarded with just negativity. And after we read this book, it always comes back to like, if that person hadn't have been kind to me, how different would my life would be, even in the smallest of ways. And then we talk about it in the story, like if Belinda and Noemi hadn't have been those agents of kindness, how would the story have changed? And the idea that it doesn't just have to live in this fictional world, like in a classroom world where it's just talk, like, but the idea that, okay, now you go, the power of kindness, you go out and do it yourself. Like, it becomes not just a story anymore. It now impacts the real world and like their own spheres of influence. So again, another long-winded teacher answer, but that's, we always start with writing, and then we share, and we bring it back to what we were writing before, and it's just been magical. So
No, I think I really resonate with your answer. I think some of the things that my leadership team that we've been grappling with as we work with grades 6 through 12 is this idea of like, how do you help students understand kindness and like teach them to be kind to one another? I like to think of myself as younger maybe than I am, but I think that the ways in which students now interact with each other, the baseline is just a lot more unkind, I guess, in a lot of ways, and even how they're interacting with their friends and their peers. So yeah, just like this idea of like, how do we teach each other to be kind, or how do we show examples of kindness and like the importance that it has in like how we function in our own just development as people. So no, that really, I think, aside from like, I think the story and the more like political aspects of the story, this idea of just kindness and human to human connection is just so important as well.
Well, I think more often than not, sadly, what's portrayed the most often in media is adults being unkind to it. Like, and that's not how all the world is, thank goodness. But like, it's what's bombarded, and it's what we see more often. So just trying to think of ways to, how do we show students like real way, like, but when they see so much unkindness from the adults that may not be directly in their lives, but it's just so prevalent now. And it's like, okay, how do we, as educators and just as adults in this nation, how do we take that narrative back? Like, how do we actually live it out, live what we want to see, and where that becomes the dominant narrative as opposed to all the negativity and hate stuff. So
I think that is an opening for a much larger discussion, but no, 100%, right? Just trying to figure that out and like tapping the source of like, how do we kind of, bring this kindness in and highlight it much more? Because obviously, like, as you said, the violence and the unkindness is much more sensationalized and it's more clickbaity. So how do we bring those in? So I'm very, again, thankful for this narrative of, people really just on a human level and an individual level showing kindness, showing up for one another in really desperate situations. So no, that really stuck with me. So thank you. So just going back to our main character of Noemi, right? Noemi? Yes. We get her first person narrative, and there is a level of awareness in her. She is aware that, her mother is worried and that she's talking about, not being met with kindness at the border at first. And she misses home. And is just really tired of waiting. You just kind of see her going through and processing all of these things as she kind of moves through the story. Could you talk about like showing that emotional toll in this like quiet way, right? Because it's not like she's having some like big reaction. It's just like she's noticing and observing all of these things happening, and it clearly is like, I feel like you can feel it taking a toll on her. So yeah, no, just understanding like more about like how you're showing this emotional toll in that quieter way, and like your thought process behind that.
Well, I was inspired by two people. Number one, my daughter. She is like myself, very much an introvert, but also extremely observant. And I think, like, I don't want to say every kid's like this, but to a certain degree, there are kids that they observe, they take in the world, and they're not, whatever the reason may be, they may not be confident or not have the words exactly to express all that they're feeling and all that they're processing. And that was very much my daughter when she was the age that I was writing this story. And so that was very much a conscious decision where I want, just like a real kid would, like, they're taking it in, they're grappling with it, they're trying to figure it out. and then giving her that ability, because she spreads kind of not with her words, it's with her actions. And I feel like when I think of kids, um, at least with my own daughter, like words could be kind of cheap. She could talk a lot sometimes with me, but like it's the action that you really see that change in kids. Like when they really grasp something, it's not just the words, it's what do they do once they've learned a certain lesson or an idea. And so that was very much a conscious decision to have a female character in honor of my daughter, processing all of this and being observant how she is, and processing it in a way that I know that would speak to her and to other kids out there.
No, I really like that, and I think that it's helpful too, because I think it highlights the emotional aspect without it being too overt in a way. And I think thinking about her as a main character, if you were to like write a note, the Notebook Keeper too, right? If you were to continue that narrative, where do you see her ending up? Like, what do you think the continuation of that story is?
It's fun. No one's ever asked me this, and it's something that I've always kind of. I don't know if I could write a second one, but like the idea in my head is where do they end up? Because at the end of the story, they don't cross. Like they're still waiting, and in my head though, I imagine them crossing, and I see them. No, I see Noemi especially being a force of change in her elementary school. Again, I wrote it when my daughter was in second grade ish, so that's kind of roughly the age of how I saw her. So I just see her being this force of kindness and positive change and influence, and using that hopefully to become like an activist herself, or like a policy maker, really getting in there and trying to solve problems because she's experienced it firsthand. So that's where I've always kind of seen the continuation of her story.
Right. No, I mean, because like again, you ended it on such a beautiful and weighty note, but I think it would be great to see kind of like what happens next for them. Like, do they cross? And if they don't, what does that look like? Right. What are they going back to potentially? And then if they do, what would that potentially new living situation and new life kind of bring for them? And then going back is I'm looking at the chat. There's a question in the chat, just kind of going back into the kindness aspect of things for a second. If you could create a Notebook Keeper inspired book list or a kindness book list, what books would you recommend for educators?
Well, number one is Each Kindness by Jacqueline Woodson and E.B. Lewis. It's a picture, but it's amazing. It's beautiful in every sense of the regard, in every sense of the word, and it also speaks like they share unintentionally like similar themes in that things aren't tight. Like again, they don't end pretty. So that's number one. Another one would be it's more middle, like lower middle grades, like fourth, fifth grade. Land of the Cranes by Aida Salazar. It's very similar, like about immigration. Her father gets deported. It's a beautiful middle grade novel in verse. It's kind of an old one, but The Sandwich Swap by Kelly DiPuccio, and she's the Princess of Jordan. I'm forgetting her name, but it's another one where it's awesome. It's a great picture book. And then there's so many. And then another one, while the themes might be not quite aligned. It's called Kafka and the Doll. It's a picture book by Larissa Toole, I think is her name, and I forget the illustrator, but it's another one, literally very similar to mine in that it takes this real person, but adds a real event involving a real person and adds a slight fictional layer to it, and it's literally about Franz Kafka, the author. And how he found this, like he spotted this little girl in a park and she was weeping, and him and his assistant go up to this little girl like, well, why are you crying? And she says, well, I lost my doll. And he turns to her and said, this is a true story. He turns to her and said like, well, your doll's just on vacation, and she sent me a letter, and I'll give it to you tomorrow. And so it's all about how Franz Kafka writes these fake letters, like for this doll, like to give to this girl, and how she's okay. It is such a beautiful picture book. And like, again, while the themes aren't exactly the same, it is such a wonderful story of kindness, of going out of your way for someone, like where like you gain nothing from this except for being kind. It's a fantastic book. So
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for that. Hopefully this is recorded, so we'll be able to go back and check
yes.
this out. And so, like, just thinking about the story in general, like, it is very different from, I think, the typical immigration story in that, a lot of times the stories are about people coming to the United States and having to integrate into society and kind of trying to figuring out how to function. Whereas this story is very much set on the border, again, in that liminal space. Do you see this as like a counter narrative, or just kind of like expanding the repertoire of like what this looks like for people?
Yeah, I guess expanding the repertoire. Like, I think that it was funny. Like, when as an author, like I've always, especially Hispanic author, Mexican American author like myself, a part of me has always been like, well, we're not just this one story, and then my first book ends up being about this story. But uh, to me, it's the other side of the coin. It's we usually see the struggle on this side of the border, and we don't often see the struggle on the other side of the border, and all that people do go through and experience. I think about the book Solito, not the author's name, but it's a memoir. That's another one I would add, not quite for younger grades, but definitely high school and up. But just that idea that it's not just, again, like where they just show up magically and like that's it, and they're people with much fuller lives before crossing this fake line. And Javier Zamora, thank you. um and so yeah, so it's more of a, like, this is the other side of the coin. This is, and not only that, but when I first heard the story of the Notebook Keeper, and it was one that I'm like, I can't believe people are going through this. Like, not only is it already incredibly difficult and the trauma of it, but then they've now added this other layer to make it even more inhumane. And I just wanted it to be told like that. People wouldn't have heard it, I feel like, or just a story that needed to be spread out more and vocalized. So yeah, so very much the other side of the coin.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, even like looking into the Notebook Keeper again, and this idea of like, it just kind of, no one really knows how it started, or like, like it just kind of happened that someone like, here's the notebook, you're going to give someone a number. And it became this unofficial system of how people kind of moved through the border and like got in or didn't get in. I think that in itself is kind of wild. And, that it's so, I think we put a lot of meaning and attachment to these systems and bureaucratic things that are going on, when actually, no, like we have no idea how it started. It wasn't a paid or official position, but someone made sure to continue it on while it was happening. So I think that also puts like another thing of just like, these things can be very arbitrary in a sense, that are dictating people's lives in very real and serious ways.
Yes.
So
Arbitrary is a great word for it. Just pointless. Just pointless.
Right. And it's just like, well, so then what is the meaning behind it? And how are we classifying who's getting in and who's getting out? And like, oh, well, you're coming from here, so that's okay. But there, that's not okay. Like, but yeah, so anyway, I think, and again, I was really connected to the character of Naomi and some of the artistic choices. So I was wondering, how much influence or inspiration did you have with the illustrator? Did you connect in terms of like, hey, did she have a blue backpack because that's something you wanted, or
no? None at all. So I will say Magdalena Mora, she's an incredible illustrator. Like, I think she also won a Pura Belpré for a different book called Still Dreaming. she's originally from Texas, and she went to the same school that my daughter went to, like an
Oh,
element, like it's just wild. But she now lives in
yeah.
the Twin Cities. But she, we had no contact at all. Like she
Oh,
like made these decisions on her own. But it's far better than anything I could have imagined. But she
okay.
actually went to the San Ysidro border to take notes and do sketches. So as far as the accuracy, I don't know how accurate, but she's definitely what went there for several days and like took a lot of inspiration from the actual
Awesome.
place. And just what I love the most is, again, not in my manuscript at all, is that all throughout there's birds, and
Mhm.
sometimes um, they're like standing like on the ground, and more often than not they're in flight. And just that idea that like the birds can travel wherever, but here we are in
Yep.
this like, again, arbitrary,
Yeah, like we've just
you know
created this space.
yeah. So her decision for that, was one that when I saw like the initial sketches, I was just blown away. Like I never would have thought of that. So it's really neat it's a testament to how picture books, especially, there's
Mhm.
such a collaboration.
Yeah.
And the illustrator will bring out ideas, their own experience, and how they connected with the story, and their ability to express those ideas far better than I could with just my words. So it was, yeah, they're beautiful illustrations.
So no, you actually you just taught me something because I did not realize that, authors might not necessarily have a lot of say in terms of the images that go with the picture book. So I think that's really awesome
Yeah,
that, without having too much collaboration, you were still able to come up with something that was really touching and meaningful. So yeah, that was I did not realize that. Um, just going back to the chat really quickly. There was a question about educators. So for, educators trying to bring your book into their classroom, what questions do you think they should ask their students to think about when reading? Like some of the guiding questions that you would pose to students.
I think I would ask them, like, how does Noemi change throughout the story? Because
Hmm.
she definitely is, while it's small, she is a dynamic character. She does have this idea of there's no kindness here, there's nothing that I can do, until she finally realizes that no, Belinda has made this decision to act that way. So how does she change? Who Another question would be, who are the Belindas in your life? And
Mhm.
are you a Belinda to someone else? And I'm trying to think what else. And just like what do you notice about, um, n- on the inverse, like not how does Noemi change overall, but what's happening to her before she finally makes this decision? Like, how is, to a degree, is she internalizing all that she's seen? Um, and then I guess the final question, one that I ask my students is, what is this trying to teach us, like as human beings, not just as readers, but what was, again, as an English teacher, it's funny to say this, but what was the author trying to tell us? What was his or her message? And that is one that usually gets the most creative responses, heartfelt responses. So
No, thank you for that. I think that's really, really helpful. Um, So I mean, and going back to the chat, someone had mentioned, the you had mentioned the birds that the illustrator had put in there. Do you have any suggestions for how, as an educator, it might help their students think about the way images impact how we understand the story?
that's a good one. I guess I would, when I get with in my own classroom, I use picture books a lot, and not just with picture books, but with any text. The question that I always ask, regardless of what it is what do you notice? What stood out to you? What small detail that maybe not all of us noticed stood out to you? And that's how I would get that ball rolling, is because then one kid may notice the birds, another kid may notice something completely different,
No.
and you as a teacher can just kind of follow the stream, like the direction of the room, like being very gregarious, and figure out what do they notice. And whether they notice the birds or not. I think just doing that exercise is teaching them to just pay attention and look for things that may not be so obvious. So hopefully that answers the question.
No, I think so. And in this conversation of just, speaking about, students kind of understanding this idea of Belinda and kindness and who are the Belindas for them, I guess, putting it back to you as the author, who was the Belinda for you?
Funny enough, my mom is her name is Belinda,
Oh,
and
awesome. I love
so
that.
that was definitely, and she didn't know that I named a character after her until she read it for the first time. And
Oh,
so,
okay.
but all of the people, like, there's several scenes where you see the inside of the notebook, and there's names that are Hispanic names, and those are all family names. There's like a part where like the names are called out, like where they say like Gano 574, Saldana 574. Like, those are all like my mother's maiden name, my grandmother's maiden name. Like it's so, but the real Belinda was my mom, and
Oh,
uh, my mom she's still alive, like, but she's always been this source of joy. She's one of 9 kids. Like neither of her parents uh, finished middle school. Like she was a migrant worker herself in the 60s. Like, and like her and all of her brothers and sisters and her grandparents would go around the country and pick strawberries in Michigan, go to California to pick peach or grapes, I think. But just so she would always tell us those stories, and it was usually what like very rarely was it like a negative thing to her. She would always talk about how like I don't know if fun's the right word that she used, but like just how formative it was, like
mhm.
to be with her family, and to like she would say I never knew need. Like it was like to us we weren't poor. It was just what life was, and we were happy. And so she instilled that outlook into me, and so she in a both a very obvious way and in a very unconscious way, she is the Belinda in the story. So.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. No, and I mean, through all of that, we're hearing like just like the very the personal weight of this book for you, right? Like this is obviously a very personal narrative for you. Were there any other or what was your personal connection, I think, to the topic of immigration?
Mhm.
So I'll start with that one first.
Yeah, so my grandfather on my dad's side was born in Mexico in the 1920s, and a very typical narrative of his parents, like there's greater opportunity for us in America, and so they made the choice to move and come across and become citizens, and it wasn't easy for them. My my on my other side, so my grandmother, that and the two ended up getting married. They were very similar stories moving to America, and my great grandfather, my grandmother's father, was a very savvy businessman and like a community man, and he was one of the first Hispanic, probably I think the first Hispanic is what I've been told, the first Mexican American to move into this very exclusive all white community just north of downtown Fort Worth. And how he had this idea like I am just as much a citizen as y'all. Like I deserve just as much access to this place as you do. And I think that was in like the 30s in Fort Worth. And so I have those two stories. Like I come from two very, very strong immigrants. And then and it was just a story that we've kind of growing up, I always heard. And, but I also, as a kid, was a victim of like assimilation to a degree, in that like I found myself as a kid. I grew up in a mostly white neighborhood in Fort Worth, and I don't think I had any Hispanic friends, Mexican American friends. And so I looked at their moments as a kid where I still remember looking at my own culture and being ashamed of it. And it's something that I like to this day, I'm just like, "God," I know I was a kid, but like
Yeah.
still just that idea. And so as I became, once I like, finished high school and stuff, I'd always loved story. And I realized, again, a very typical story, that there aren't a lot of stories for Mexican American. There were not a lot of stories that I loved that featured kids like me or my brother and sister. And I knew that I wanted to change that. And I just think of who my family, like where I came from, and I finally looked at them with new eyes. And it's like I want to honor like their journey, like like I'm here because of them and their sacrifices. And I want kids like that are like me, like I want them to see themselves in their own, in the stories that they read, and like a TV show, like that's a huge desire for me. So I feel like I've gone all over the place, but that's kind of where I started. So like that's my background. And I am like like I am my ancestors' wildest dream. Like I am doing what they had always hoped their family would be and do, and just trying to honor that. And yeah.
No, thank you for sharing that. Honestly, no, and I think it just adds, like you can tell. I think that this book, regardless of what it was very deeply personal, right? So I think that came through upon reading it and just kind of going through it without having had this conversation at all. So this adds so much more layers and nuance, and I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So my second question was, were there any other texts maybe that informed or inspired you writing this book, specifically?
Yeah. So the main story that I that inspired this, like without it, it wouldn't exist, was I was driving home from a family funeral. I was alone. My wife and daughter didn't come with me. And my uncle had passed away very suddenly. Not expect. He was in great health and just died very suddenly. And on my way back, um, just kind of processing grief, and I just couldn't be alone with my thoughts. And so I opened up my podcast app on my phone, literally clicked the This American Life, and I just did like one of those. I have my like just one of those, like just flicked it and just press play on whatever one my finger landed on. And it happened to be an episode of This American Life. And it's called "Let Me Count the Ways" if you're interested. Um, that's the title of the episode. And it's all about the last administration's handling of things at the border. And the very first story was them interviewing one of the notebook keepers. And it just shook me to my core. And I think on that drive home, I must have listened to it 4 or 5 times, just that segment alone. And I was learning to become, like, I was trying to cut my teeth on becoming a picture book writer. I didn't have an agent or anything. I was just like, I want to do this. And my wife would turn to me one day. It's like, you haven't stopped talking about this story. Like, just write it. And so that's like the main text that inspired all of it, is this story. And there's been several other like there's an article in the Los Angeles Times and all about this. And
Mhm.
but I think when it comes to fiction, I think Land of the Cranes by Aida Salazar is definitely one, because I'm a huge poetry fan, and it's just a beautiful story in verse that deals with these types of topics. And that definitely inspired me as well.
No, and I think, thinking about, like, yeah, the 2016, like, time era in which this was happening, and the border shut down because of COVID, and kind of this practice discontinued. Do you feel like, this story is now still relevant, right? Like, now that this practice has ended, what is
Yeah.
the relevancy for you now?
Well, I mean, regardless, even though it has ended, it goes back to like what I mentioned earlier. It's the
Mhm.
other side of the coin. Like,
Right.
for a brief amount of time, there were people that experienced this. And I think like their story needs to be told and deserves to be told. And while I'm, again, just a humble English teacher, like it deserves to be recorded in some way. And what better way than for kids to grapple with it and to be exposed to it in a safe way. And so yeah, I think it's definitely still relevant, like, because again, like it was real. Like for 3 years, it's what people had to go through, and um, yeah. So
No, I thank you for that. No, I agree. I do think that this is something where these themes transcend even this specific moment in time. So it's really important, I think, for the story to get told and for us to really keep hold of it and not forget. Um,
I love that, Julie. That's
yeah,
awesome.
right. So at this point, I would love to open it up more exclusively to the chat. If there are any questions that you have for Stephen, anything that you would like to know more about, help in your classroom, anything of that nature.
None. No, like just the story itself and the words, but no influence except for when my editor showed me like the initial um like illustrations. I was like, yes, more of this. This is amazing. It's beautiful. So
I'm still not over that. That's kind of wild that like it's just so like they're happening in two separate areas and that you still were able to get something so beautiful out of it.
mhm. Most picture books are like that. Very, very rarely do the authors have a say. So
I would not have, I'm not gonna lie, I would not have thought that. I am a novice to the picture book world. So I would have not thought
yeah.
that at all. I'm like, I would have thought that it would have been like very hand in hand, like we're locked in with what's going on.
But
Any other? So this next question from Christina. I love your idea for a free write about kindness. Do you have suggestions for how educators might approach other warm-up conversations to get help to help their students get ready to engage with the story?
I think actually what Julie's idea is a really great way. Like, listen to the segment. It's maybe 4 or 5 minutes long. It's not long, and then like what stood out to you in this segment. Like respond to it. Like what what stood out to you. What frustrated you. What um, angered you, and see where that goes. And all right, now let's read this story. But I feel like writing is, when it comes to stories, this is my own personal take as an educator, is that writing into stories is the best way to do it, is to get your students to be reflective and just pause and think about the deeper themes without them realizing it. And then once they are exposed to that text, it just opens up all these doors of connection. It increases comprehension. Um, so just kind of be mindful, like what good question could I ask for this story, for any other story, to get the ball rolling, get the gears greased before we tackle a text. So um, I'm drawing a blank. It's been a long day about what questions to ask specifically, but that's what I would do. So
All right, awesome. And then Natalie, she's asking, are you writing anything now?
yeah, always writing. But I just submitted a picture book um, in verse, and it's a biography about Jovita Idar. She was a Mexican American journalist and educator and activist, turn of the century, and she was so far ahead of her time, and just stood up for. She was a suffragette, just an amazing woman, and they just recently, the U.S. Mint made a quarter in her honor just a few weeks ago, like a month ago. So that's one that hopefully will be picked up by someone. If there's an editor in the room, please buy it. But other than that, I have my next picture book comes out with the same publisher, Random House Studio. It's called Tamales for Christmas, and it is about it's about it's kind of no, it's all true. It's a true story of my own grandmother, and the one that didn't finish middle school. And so my mom's one of nine. I'm one of like 24 grandkids. She had 30 something great grandkids. Like there's a ton of us in my family, but it's about how one Christmas, so she would always make tamales and sell them Christmas money to buy gifts. But so this story, Tamales for Christmas, is about the season that she made and sold 1,000 dozen tamales from her tiny little kitchen in Fort Worth, Texas. And I cannot wait for it to come out. It's I'm really excited for it. So it comes out next fall.
I'm excited to get that story. Yeah, that seems like that's a lot of tamales.
Yeah, right.
And then we have a question from a little bit earlier in the chat from Megan, just saying that your reasons for behind writing this were so beautiful. Do your own children love and, own their Mexican heritage now?
Yeah, funny. My wife is white and I'm Mexican American. And so my daughter, she'll, and my wife is also half Lebanese, and so she'll eat like guacamole in one hand and then tabbouleh in the other, and so it's one that she's learning to embrace. It's almost definitely a different experience than mine. Like my own parents were, when they were in school, they were encouraged to not speak Spanish, to like you only speak English, you maybe speak Spanish with us, and it was very much learning to, like, they were grappling with a very different society now. And so my daughter has learned to embrace it and love it. And it's really neat in that it's not as big of a deal as it was when I was growing up, which I think is a win, is that she's comfortable in her own skin. She knows who she is. And yeah, so it's been good.
All right, awesome. Are there any other questions for the chat? Nope.
Cool.
All right. So with that being said, I know it's been a long day of teaching for you. And I just want to thank you so much, Stephen, for being here. And thank you for the teachers and guests for attending this panel on immigration themes in the Latinx Kidlit Book Festival. And I wish everyone a wonderful evening. So thank you all.
Thank y'all.